The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Harvard's grand auditorium, painting long streaks of golden light across rows of polished wooden benches. The air was heavy with anticipation. It wasn't every day that the university hosted an open demonstration from its most celebrated minds, and today, word had spread across campus that something truly extraordinary was about to happen. Students, professors, alumni, and even visitors from the city had gathered, filling every seat. Conversations buzzed like a low electric hum. At the center of the auditorium stood an enormous blackboard that stretched almost the full width of the stage. Several pieces of fresh white chalk rested neatly on the ledge beneath it. In front of the board, a small podium had been placed, with a microphone standing tall, ready for the speaker. The stage lights glowed warmly, illuminating the space with a sense of importance. From the side entrance, a man in a dark gray suit emerged, tall, confident, and clearly accustomed to the weight of attention. This was Professor Jonathan Price, a mathematician whose name was whispered in the same breath as Einstein's and Ramanujan's when it came to pure genius. Price approached the microphone with measured steps, letting the murmurs settle before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice deep and deliberate, "today you will witness something unusual." He paused, letting the suspense settle. "This equation," he gestured toward the clean, untouched board, "has baffled some of the greatest minds of our generation. It is not in your textbooks. It is not in the journals. It is, for lack of a better term, unsolved." The crowd leaned in. The crowd. You could almost hear the creak of wood as dozens shifted forward in their seats. "This problem," he continued, "has been passed around quietly for years among mathematicians, whispered about in emails, drawn on napkins in conferences, scribbled in notebooks, and abandoned in frustration. Many have tried, none have succeeded. Some of my colleagues claim it cannot be done." A few students in the front row smirked, as if silently accepting a personal challenge. Professor Price turned his back to the audience and, with a single stroke, pressed the chalk against the blackboard. The soft screech of chalk filled the room as symbols, numbers, and Greek letters began to take shape, flowing quickly, effortlessly across the board. The line of mathematics stretched across the surface, dense with exponents, integrals, and seemingly impossible relationships between variables. By the time he was finished, the entire left side of the board was covered in an elegant yet intimidating string of logic that only a handful of people in the room could fully comprehend. He stepped aside, allowing the audience to take it in. "There it is," he said simply, as if presenting a piece of dangerous art. "A problem no one in this room will solve today. Perhaps not ever." The words drew a ripple of murmurs. A young woman in the third row, wearing the crimson sweater of a Harvard graduate student, leaned toward her friend. "It's probably a trick," she whispered. "He's just building hype." But Price continued, as if feeding the tension. "I am inviting anyone here, student, professor, visitor, to attempt it. Come up here. Use this chalk. Show us what you've got. But..." He let the pause linger like a storm cloud. "I warn you, this puzzle has defeated people far more experienced than anyone here." The first volunteer came quickly. A tall graduate student with messy brown hair bounded up the steps with an air of bravado. He took the chalk, studied the equation for several seconds, and began writing. The audience watched in polite silence. 10 minutes later, his confidence had drained. His lines of chalk ended in hesitant erasures and crossed-out calculations. Finally, he shrugged, muttered something about needing more time, and handed the chalk back to Price. Next came a professor from the physics department, an older man with years of academic prestige. The room watched with reverence as he approached the board. But even he, after nearly 15 minutes of intense concentration, stepped away with a slow shake of the head. "It's elegant," he admitted quietly. But the solution isn't there. One by one, challengers came and went. A mathematician visiting from another university, an eager undergraduate who thought his unconventional approach would work, a visiting engineer who scribbled pages of notes before even touching the board. All failed. As the clock ticked on, the mood in the room shifted from excitement to something heavier. The problem, it seemed, was exactly what Price had claimed: impossible. The murmurs now carried a note of resignation. Finally, Price stepped forward once again, his hands clasped behind his back. "You see," he said with a small, almost smug smile, "sometimes in life we face challenges that simply cannot be conquered. And in those moments we must accept that some things," he tapped the board lightly, "are just not meant to be solved." There was a ripple of uneasy laughter. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked frustrated, as if they had just been told a cruel truth about the limits of human intelligence. And yet, somewhere in the back of the auditorium, a quiet hand began to rise. The air in the auditorium hung heavy with the scent of chalk dust and quiet defeat. Professor Price had just declared the problem unsolvable, his words echoing faintly against the high-arched ceiling. Some were already gathering their coats, ready to leave with the smug satisfaction of having witnessed history, even if no breakthrough had come. Others lingered, still staring at the blackboard as though sheer willpower might make the numbers arrange themselves into a solution. It was in this moment, when the challenge seemed truly dead, that a small, hesitant hand rose from the back row. No one noticed at first. The crowd's attention was still on the front of the room, where Price stood like a victorious gatekeeper over the problem. But the hand remained raised, steady despite the growing rustle of people moving in their seats. And then, from the shadowed corner of the auditorium, a voice piped up, young, high, and almost swallowed by the vast room. I can try." A few heads turned, then more. A ripple of confusion moved through the audience. Standing there, barely tall enough for his head to peek over the back of the seat in front of him, was a boy, no more than 9 years old. His hair was a mess of dark curls, and his sneakers were scuffed, as though they'd survived years of playground battles. He wore a blue hoodie that seemed one size too big and clutched a worn-out notebook to his chest. A couple of students in the next row chuckled. "Is this a joke?" one whispered. Professor Price's brow furrowed slightly. "Son," he began, his tone measured, "this problem is far beyond the scope of your schoolwork. I appreciate your courage, but I want to try," the boy interrupted, his voice firm but polite. The interruption drew a few gasps, not out of rudeness, but because it carried an unexpected steadiness. Price glanced toward the audience, as though weighing whether to indulge the child or simply end the event. After a moment, perhaps deciding there was no harm in humoring him, Price gestured toward the stage. "Very well," he said, his voice tinged with mild amusement. "Come up here." The boy began the long walk down the aisle. Every pair of eyes followed him, some with curiosity, others with quiet disbelief. His small sneakers squeaked faintly on the polished floor. He didn't rush. He didn't fidget. He simply walked, as though he belonged there. When he reached the stage, Price offered him a piece of chalk. The boy took it carefully, almost reverently, as though holding something fragile. Then he turned to the massive blackboard, the equation looming over him like a giant. The top of the board was far out of his reach, but the part he needed, the tangled heart of the problem, was right at eye level. The room settled into complete silence. Even the faint hum of the old ceiling fans seemed to disappear. He opened his notebook on the podium beside him. The pages were filled with handwritten equations, diagrams, and numbers that to the untrained eye looked like chaos. But the boy glanced at them only briefly, as though confirming a memory. Then, with small but steady strokes, he began to write. It wasn't the frantic, erratic scribbling of someone guessing blindly. His movements were deliberate, each number and symbol appearing in a clean line, as if he had already worked it out in his mind. The first step drew a soft murmur from a professor in the front row. Recognition. The boy's method wasn't random. It was unconventional, yes, but rooted in sound logic. He kept going. His small hand moved quickly now, weaving through algebraic manipulations, substitutions, and geometric reasoning that blended techniques from different branches of mathematics. Occasionally, he would pause, not out of hesitation, but as though his mind had already jumped 3 steps ahead and was waiting for his hand to catch up. Someone in the middle rows leaned toward their neighbor and whispered, "Wait!" That might actually work. 5 minutes passed. The blackboard began to fill with fresh chalk lines, neat but dense, stretching from one side to the other. The audience, which at first had been prepared to smile politely and move on, was now leaning forward, eyes narrowed in focus. You could feel the shift in the room, the curiosity deepening into fascination, then into something sharper. Hope. Professor Price had moved closer, his arms still folded but his posture tense. His eyes darted over the boy's work, scanning each step with the speed of someone who could spot a flaw instantly. But so far, there was no flaw. By the 10-minute mark, a low buzz of whispers had filled the room, though no one dared speak, too loudly. A visiting mathematician in the third row scribbled notes furiously, following the boy's logic as though afraid it might vanish from memory if not captured. The boy didn't seem to notice any of it. He was somewhere else entirely, inside the problem, navigating its corridors with the ease of someone who could see a hidden map the rest had missed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity and yet no time at all, he placed the chalk back on the ledge. His small hands were dusted white. He stepped back and looked at the board, not with pride, not with fear, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone checking the final piece of a puzzle. He turned to Price. "That's the answer," he said, simply. The room held its breath. Price stepped forward, scanning the board from left to right, top to bottom. His eyes moved quickly at first, then slowed. The furrow in his brow deepened, not in skepticism, but in concentration. He traced the flow of the solution like a man following a trail he had long believed led nowhere, only to find it reaching a destination. The silence stretched on. The boy waited, still calm. And then, very softly, Price said, "My God." A gasp rippled through the audience. Price turned back to the crowd, his voice louder now, his expression almost incredulous. "It's correct." The words broke the silence like a thunderclap. Students exchanged wide-eyed looks. Professors stared at the board as though seeing it for the first time. Somewhere in the back, a single pair of hands began to clap, hesitant. At first, then joined by another and another. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted in applause, the sound crashing against the walls in waves. The boy smiled faintly, though he didn't bow or bask in it. He simply closed his notebook, tucked it under his arm, and stepped down from the stage as quietly as he had arrived. For most in that room, the day would become a story they'd tell for years. The day a 9-year-old solved the unsolvable at Harvard. But for the boy, it was just another problem, and he already had his eyes on the next one. The applause inside the Harvard auditorium rolled like thunder, swelling with each passing second. People were on their feet now, clapping until their palms stung, some whistling, some shaking their heads in disbelief. And in the middle of it all stood a 9-year-old boy, quiet, almost shy, the very picture of humility in the face of his own brilliance. But even as the room celebrated, there was something else in the air. A stunned silence beneath the noise. The kind that comes only when people are forced to reevaluate everything they thought they knew. Professor Jonathan Price had spent his career standing in front of audiences as the unquestioned authority. He had built a reputation not just on his intelligence, but on his certainty. And yet now, standing beside the boy's chalk-covered solution, he felt something rare and unfamiliar: awe. He turned to the child, lowering his voice so only those nearby could hear. How did you see it?" The boy glanced at the board as though surprised the question even needed asking. "It was like the numbers were talking to each other," he said simply. "They weren't fighting. They were just waiting to be put in the right order." Price blinked. To him, the equation had always been a battlefield, numbers and variables locked in endless conflict, refusing to yield a winner. But the boy had walked in and made peace. In the second row, a senior mathematics professor leaned toward her colleague. "Do you realize what this means? The implications?" She trailed off, her voice swallowed by the applause. The boy took a small step back from the board, letting the crowd take in his work. Some were snapping pictures with their phones, trying to capture each line before it was erased, afraid the solution might disappear like a dream upon waking. Others simply stared, their minds still racing to understand what had just happened. It was then that Price raised his hand, and slowly, the applause began to fade. The last claps echoed in the high ceiling before the room fell completely silent again. He looked at the boy for a long moment, then turned to the audience. "Today," he said, his voice steady but charged with emotion, "we have witnessed something extraordinary. A problem that has stood unsolved for decades. A problem I myself believed was beyond resolution, has been answered here in this room by someone who hasn't even finished middle school." He let the words sink in. "This is not just a triumph of mathematics," he continued. "This is a reminder that genius does not ask permission, that curiosity, creativity, and courage are not limited by age, title, or experience. Today, we have been reminded that impossible is nothing more than a word." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience, but it was more than agreement. It was humility. Many of the people in that room had walked in certain of their place in the intellectual hierarchy. They would walk out knowing that hierarchy had just been shattered. A journalist from a local paper raised her hand. "What's his name?" she called out. The boy hesitated, almost as if reluctant to answer. Finally, he said softly, "Eli." "Eli what?" "Just Eli," he replied with a small shrug. The audience chuckled, but there was something in his tone, an ease, a quiet confidence, that made it clear he wasn't trying to be mysterious. He simply didn't see the need for more. Price, perhaps, sensing the moment was too rare to waste, bent slightly so he could meet Eli's gaze. "Eli," he said, "do you understand what you've done here today?" The boy tilted his head, considering the question. "I solved a problem," he said. Price smiled faintly. "Yes, you did." From the back of the room, a voice shouted, "Get that kid into Harvard!" The crowd laughed and applauded again, but Eli didn't seem to hear them. His eyes were already drifting back to his notebook, as if his mind was wandering to the next puzzle waiting to be cracked. Meanwhile, Price turned back to the board and studied it again. The solution was brilliant. Not just technically correct, but elegant. There were no wasted steps, no unnecessary flourishes. It was the kind of work that seasoned mathematicians spend lifetimes chasing, and it had come from a boy whose feet barely reached the floor when he sat. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. That towering board, once an impassable, wall of intellectual complexity, now stood conquered by the smallest person present. It was a scene no one would forget. Eventually, the formal event wound down. People filed out in clusters, talking animatedly, their voices echoing down Harvard's stone corridors. But even as they left, many glanced back at the stage, as though afraid the sight of Eli's solution might vanish if they turned away for too long. Eli himself slipped away quietly, disappearing into the throng. By the time some realized they wanted to speak to him, to ask him about his method or his background, he was gone. All that remained was the chalkboard, still covered in the proof that had just rewritten a small corner of mathematical history. Later, in the quiet after, the crowd had dispersed. Price stood alone on the stage. He looked at the board one last time before picking up the eraser. He hesitated, then carefully copied the solution into his own notebook before wiping it away. The chalk dust swirled in the light as the once unsolvable problem vanished, replaced by a clean, empty slate. As he closed his notebook, Price found himself smiling, not the smile of a man defeated, but of one humbled and renewed. Somewhere out there, a 9-year-old boy had just reminded him why he had fallen in love with mathematics in the first place. And in years to come, whenever he lectured about creativity, perseverance, and the beauty of problem-solving, Price would tell the story of the day Eli walked into Harvard and proved that impossible was just a word.